Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. This is the first in a special series, A Life in Politics, where we shine a spotlight on individuals who've spent a career on the benches of public service. This week, I'm joined by Stephen Brine, an MP of 14 years, whose journey from BBC radio journalist to Member of Parliament for Winchester has been marked by perseverance and passion. He's defied his own party at times to stand by his beliefs. But now he's decided to step away from Parliament and won't be standing in the next election. Stephen Brine has advocated for one nation conservatism and has always focused on the needs of his constituents. We'll explore how his experiences have shaped his view on the Conservative Party, on Parliament and the future of Britain. So without further ado, Stephen Brine, thank you for joining me today.
Welcome.
Interesting journey, the complete opposite to me here. You started life as a broadcaster and went into politics. Remember 2010? What was the feeling? Do you remember what it was like when you won that first election?
Oh yeah, because there was absolutely no certainty I'd win. And I'd been the candidate for 3+ years. It was a very safe Lib Dem seat. And when I won it, I remember I got announced at like 5 in the morning in the old River Park Leisure Centre in Winchester. By 5:30, I had my first piece of casework. The next day you go to Westminster, you remember. Yeah. You know, there's no American-style easing into the role here.
But that's interesting. So I personally believe that no one really knows what they're getting into. So when you look back, your expectations of what it would be like to be an MP, how did that work out?
I think the truth is, Nick, that you're so focused on winning. When you actually do then win, you're suddenly thrust into the job. As I say, there's no easing into it. You're straight in there. I remember going to Westminster that first day and the doorkeepers, you know, who are dressed so smartly. I saw these little green tickets on the back of the seats in the chamber, the prayer cards, which bags your seat for the day. And I said, why are they there? And they said, well, they are for members to bags their seat for the day. And no one else can sit there, but you can sit there whenever you like, Mr. Brine. And that's when I thought, actually, I did win. And this is pretty cool. And then, of course, you've got to put an office together with your staff to make sure you can do that casework, because that's the bedrock of the job.
Should they have training for MPs?
No, because there's no job description. And the truth is that you can do as much or as little as you want. Now, I'm a workaholic. When I had a 3,000 majority, I did it the same as when I had a 17,000 majority. But I don't think, you know, there are ways that old hands can help you with the procedures of the House and all those sort of getting those nuts and bolts right. But there's no real manual as to how to do it.
And you don't really think there should be then, judging by what you're saying?
I don't think there can be. Whether there should be is another matter. But I mean, a couple of old MPs, and Charlie Walker, who's leaving at the election like me, and Julian Lewis, an MP in New Forest in Hampshire, they did some courses for new MPs in 2010. And they did it again in 2015.
What was the best bit of advice you got?
I think the best bit of advice that I was given actually was by David Cameron and George Osborne, who said, just sit in the chamber. Just sit at the back, in the back row. You don't need to say anything, just watch. Just watch people like John Redwood. Watch how they do it. It was good advice.
Well, certainly look, listen and learn is one thing, but let's now move on to some very memorable moments of your career. Let's talk Brexit for a start. We've actually got a little look back at what the time was like in the country and in Westminster. So let's remind ourselves of that first.
The sun has risen on an independent, united kingdom.
I expect to go to the palace and offer my resignation.
It is and will always remain a matter of deep regret to me that I have not been able to deliver Brexit.
To get Brexit over the line by October.
Can I just bust one of the most dishonest myths of all, that you can respect the referendum result and be in favour of leaving with a deal?
We have a deal.
Now, interestingly, what we've just seen there was your view that you gave when you voted against a no-deal Brexit. A momentous thing for you to do because you wanted to vote what was called Ben's Law at the time. And no deal for you was a red line you didn't want to cross. Now, regardless of the principles behind it that you stuck to, that must have been an incredibly hard decision to make, to basically defy your party and lose what we call the whip.
Yeah, and the Ben Act, as it became, is Hilary Benn, so Tony Benn's son, who basically put down a change to the order paper, which the government normally controls. So we had to vote to take control of the order paper. Then we had to vote through this act, which basically said it would be illegal to leave with no deal. And I believe when Boris Johnson took over that was very much the posture. That was very much the road on which we were headed. And I felt, as a constituency MP, which is first and foremost your responsibility, I felt that Brexit was the wrong decision. I argued very strongly for us to remain, but I'm a Democrat. I accepted the result of the referendum, but it was a very close result. And I thought that to leave with no deal in place whatsoever for all sorts of sectors would have been just an act of self-harm on my constituents and my country. So I did what I thought was right, and I was thrown out of the Tory party as a result.
You were, which of course made huge news at the time. Beyond the headlines, it's a very close-knit community of MPs. The Conservatives all sit together at one end of a room called the tea room, Labour at the other end. How did your colleagues respond to you? Because this was quite a toxic time in politics.
You're taking me back over private grief here, but actually when I went into the tea room the next morning, I felt like guilty. Like I felt like I shouldn't sit with my colleagues. And where do I sit? Some ghastly prospect of sitting with the Liberal Democrats or something. But actually, everyone was really nice. And I think, you remember, MPs ultimately respect people for doing what they think is right in here. And I did what I thought was right in my heart. And I think actually, in all the votes over the last 14 years I've been in there, if you can look yourself in the mirror after that vote, you've done the right thing. And I knew I did that day. And actually everyone was very nice. And I wasn't, it wasn't personal against Boris. I mean, I happen to think he was all suited to the job as Prime Minister, but that vote wasn't personal against him. It was about my constituents, what they were saying to me, and it was about what I thought was right for the country and for the health service, where I had just been a minister for 2 years. So I did what I thought was the right thing to do.
What about the pressure, though? Because there is a convention of behaviour. If you're going to rebel, I remember being told myself, you have the courtesy to let the whips know that you're going to rebel. And at that moment on, the pressure's applied, isn't it?
Yeah, although, do you know what? Maybe I'm just rose-coloured remembering this, but I don't remember that much pressure. And the Prime Minister had made it very clear, as had the Chief Whip, that this was what we call a confidence issue. That, if you break the whip on this, it's lose the whip time. So they had made it very clear. I knew the jeopardy that was involved. And so there wasn't that much pressure put on me. I think what I learned, my lesson, my advice to new MPs would be, when you make up your mind how you're going to vote, never say, I'm thinking of voting against. I am voting against. Final decision, as they say on the show. And I made it very clear that was my decision. And actually, they left me alone. And then probably an hour after the vote, I got a message from the then Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, saying, I regret to inform you, you've lost the whip.
It's no doubt that was quite hard to take, but let's
really
just move on a little bit from that, because you got it restored with the prospect of a general election coming in December 2019. And a briefing was given by Number 10 after a number of you, not all of you, went to see the Prime Minister, and he subsequently returned the whips. And it said this, and this is what it said: the Prime Minister made it very clear to them, that's you and your colleagues, that he is a one-nation Conservative and it is important the party moves forward. I'm sure you can believe that he thought it's important the party moves forward, but do you for a minute believe he was being candid with you and honest with you when he said he's a one-nation Conservative?
In many ways, Boris is actually a centrist one-nation Conservative, probably more so than Rishi Sunak. But of course, he had taken this route on Brexit. It wasn't quite how it was. He basically said he knew full well that he wanted to win the election. He didn't know he was going to win big. He knew he needed to win seats like mine in Winchester and Chandler's-Ford, and he knew the best chance of that was with me. And as I said, it wasn't personal. I wasn't nasty about it. I didn't go out on the media and say unpleasant things about him or the party.
It was a very public fallout.
It was a very public fallout, but I made a decision based on a principle. And I think people who then went on to to compound it in a way. And there was a big vote as to whether we should cancel party conference that year. People who then voted against the government on that, they didn't get the whip back. I hadn't made it personal, and I made it clear that I would be willing to have the whip back and to stand again. You know, I've never been an independently wealthy person. I've got young children and a mortgage to pay. You know, this is my livelihood and my income as well as my profession. And when he asked me to come back and fight the election in Winchester, I was pleased to do so. And actually, it helped me in Winchester because Winchester hates Brexit by and large. And they saw an MP who'd stood up for them, put his neck on the line when it mattered. And actually, I think that and Jeremy Corbyn helped me greatly when it came to the 2019 election.
Well, I didn't think I'd ever hear you say thank you, Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I do.
You would say. But look, you voted Remain, as you candidly said. You've never hidden that. And you made it clear, though, that you would support Brexit with a deal, as you did in 2019, and even before you were kicked out of the party. But now, at this period in time, months away from the general election when you're about to step down, do you still feel Brexit was a mistake? And let me ask you directly, as time has moved on, is it still a mistake?
I believe so. Actually, you're right. I voted for a deal. I actually voted for a deal more times than Boris Johnson did. And I said, if he brings back a deal, I said this in the chamber, I said it to him personally, if he brings back a deal, I'll scrutinise his deal, but I'll more than likely vote for his deal. I mean, look, I look at now, I chair the Health and Social Care Select Committee. I look at some of the impacts of cross-border working in health, medicines regulation. I sit on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. I look at some of the issues around touring artists. I look at things called European content. We're making films in this country and that then being used in the European community. And there are still many problems with Brexit. And there's practicalities, and then there's what we feel in our hearts about being part of a wider project, of a wider European project. I never believed ceding a little bit of sovereignty to be part of the European Union was a big problem. We cede a lot of our sovereignty, Nick, to be a member of NATO. In fact, we commit to go to war on behalf of other countries.
This sounds like someone who still thinks it was the wrong decision. But do you think Britain can make the best of it and come out stronger?
100%, yes.
You're not standing for election, so you can be clear.
I am not going to sit here and say, I was totally wrong. Brexit's been a roaring success. I think the truth is that 8 years on, it's still actually quite early to tell as to whether Brexit's been a great success. There have been negatives to it. There have been some benefits to it, like some of the other trade deals we've been able to do outside of the EU. But I mean, candidly, I think it was a mistake, and I don't think there's any prospect of us re-entering. But yeah, absolutely we can make it work, and absolutely we can make the best of it. But would I rather we hadn't started from here? Yeah, we threw all the pieces up in the air, and we didn't know where they were going to land. And what's more, we had no plan for if it was a leave vote.
For which perhaps that blame is with David Cameron more than anyone else.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, let's turn to, frankly, one of the other huge issues that took place in your time in Parliament. I'm just going to take us down memory lane again briefly, because I want to talk about the coronavirus pandemic as well. It was a formative experience for millions around the world, of course. But let's take a look at how it played out in the UK and Westminster in particular.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Throughout this entire crisis, we've tried to protect people's jobs and incomes to a considerable degree. That's what the furlough scheme did.
The weariness, and it must be said anger, of my constituents in Winchester that we're here again is palpable. There's also widespread scepticism that a second national lockdown is right or fair.
We are now beginning to turn the tide.
Well, as we can see from there, a surreal time, what was going on. It's probably a trip down memory lane no one really likes going. But you had some very strong views. In fact, perhaps you will be remembered for someone who had very strong and principled views. You voted against the second national lockdown. The interesting thing I found about this is that, and perhaps we conclude you're not a personality-led politician in judging people, but rather policy. You were in the same lobby as people who you had been on the completely diametrically opposed to on Brexit. Graham Brady, Ian Duncan Smith, Esther McVeigh, serial rebels like Christopher Chope. You talked about not wanting a second lockdown because you did not want to see a cycle of despair repeated. What did you mean by that?
Also Mark Harper, who
Yes,
led the
that's true.
COVID recovery group, who was in that lobby. It's interesting, isn't it, watching that film, just that you must stay at home. It sends a chill, doesn't it? And you remember just how horrendous it was. What I meant by that is I had been the public health minister and I had been preparing the draft pandemic flu bill. That was partly my responsibility. It became the draft coronavirus bill that we eventually managed to pass very quickly. And we had been pretty much focused on there being a flu pandemic. That was the number one issue on the government's risk register. When we then had what's called a novel coronavirus, which is like a
Can I just ask you, did you ever have a bit of paper that said we might get a novel coronavirus and flu's not the thing?
No, it was all about influenza. But a coronavirus is exactly that. But it was a novel coronavirus. If it had been a flu pandemic, there were things that we needed to do, but we would have known how to treat it. This was novel. It was scary time. It was scary pants time because we didn't know what we were dealing with. So there was no question that I, as a former health minister and the health secretary at the time, had been asked me, make sure you will be voting for this lockdown, won't you? I said 100% because we just don't, we're flying blind here.
The first one we're talking
But when it came to the second one, I didn't think that we had taken enough of account of the other factors. So in politics, there's always an implication for an action and there's always an implication for non-action. And the reverse is true. And when it came to that second lockdown, I didn't think that we were considering all the other implications about the educational impact, about the health impact. We paused cancer treatment in many trusts, the cancer screening programs, the breast cancer screening program, which I lost my mother to. I just felt that the unintended consequences of second lockdown were most certainly not considered enough in Parliament, which at the time, you remember, was sitting with sparse numbers of MPs. I was in Westminster every week but one during the pandemic and taking part as much as I could in scrutinising the government's decision. But I didn't think the case had been made. And my great sadness is that the COVID inquiry is just becoming a circus, obsessed with personalities and who said what about whom on WhatsApp. There's so much that inquiry should be getting to the heart of, and it's not because it's an obsessed with personality cult.
Well, that's a very neat summary. You mentioned Chair of Select Committee. I'm going to come to that in a moment and talk about that. But I'd like to go slightly stage right on health with you here, because you got into a little bit of hot water and public hot water when it came to a suggestion that you'd broken lobbying rules when you were advocating using a particular company that you knew well and were involved with. Now, given that you were not found guilty, for want of a word,
quite the opposite,
of any financial profiteering from the recommendations. Tell me, do you think actually Parliament has got it right when it comes to assessing the behaviour of MPs who are charged, rightly or wrongly, with having broken the rules?
Well, look, MPs should be held to the same standard as everybody else. They shouldn't be held to a lesser standard than other people, but they shouldn't be held to a greater standard. There is a huge bureaucracy around the regulatory environment that scrutinises MPs, both in office and for 2 years after you leave office, to make sure that things are done properly. And the right form of words are used in text messages during a national emergency and a national pandemic. And sometimes, guess what? MPs are human and they make mistakes. But by and large, actually, the rules are very robust and there are good people that are enforcing the rules, and it's up to MPs to familiarise themselves.
Did you feel a sense of injustice, though? Because you were simply, in my opinion, and I may be criticised for this, you were saying the call went out for help, suppliers, you responded, you didn't make money out of that.
Correct.
But you were actually held up in the press as another wicked Tory with his hand in the trough.
Yeah, but that's part of the job, isn't it? That you are a public figure. A public man's time is the public's, and because of that, there is scrutiny upon you. And I've been doing this now for 14 years, and one of the reasons why I'm leaving Parliament is because actually I'd quite like to be a private citizen again.
Look, you follow in the footsteps of a former Secretary of State for Health, Jeremy Hunt. He's now Chancellor. And yourself, as a Minister in Theresa May's government for Health, becoming Chair of the Select Committee. Is this a case of kind of poacher turned gamekeeper? And how does that sit with you when you're doing this job, effectively scrutinising your own government and holding them to account?
It's the best job I've had in Westminster. Jeremy phoned me up and said, "You'll never guess what she, who shall not be named, has asked me to do." I said, "No, go on." He said, "Be Chancellor. Why don't you run for the Select Committee job?" And yeah, I'm a bit poacher turned gamekeeper. I actually believe very strongly that former ministers shouldn't chair the Select Committees where they were a minister for a period, certainly for a number of years after they've left office. So I had been out for a while when I did it. And I spent my whole time as a health minister, and it seemed to me I had a whole department whose job it was to keep me off the media in case I said something wrong they didn't like or Number 10 didn't like. Now I have a whole team of clerks whose job it is to get me on the media to talk about the inquiries we're doing.
Do you think it's effective, though, or do ministers just ignore it?
No. I, as a minister, I always took very seriously my appearances before the Select Committee. They're much harder than they are in the chamber. In the chamber, basically, the speaker's always going like this too.
But your reports?
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. And we write our reports, and as a minister, I used to take them very seriously, and we pore very, very carefully over our reports. We've just done one on assisted dying, assisted suicide. We're doing prevention, we're doing cancer, and actually there's a lot of good ideas in these reports because this is where, as you remember, the good work goes on.
Well, indeed, but I'm going to challenge you on one thing, and it's not a Steve Brine issue, but it's definitely a Chair of Health Select Committee and indeed a government issue. Do you think one of the most hideous broken promises in many ways of both the former Labour government and now the Conservative government is there is no coherent plan for social care? And as chair of the Health Select Committee, is there any chance we might get a political consensus and actually deal with a problem that affects both our NHS and extraordinary indignity that people are suffering in old age?
There is that much chance for a cross-party consensus. There needs to be a plan. And Boris came in and said he had a plan, and David Cameron said that he was going to solve this one. And if you remember, Boris even legislated for an extra 1% on national insurance to fund this social care plan. Theresa May tried to bring out a social care policy in the middle of a general election campaign. Look where that ended up. This hasn't been solved. It is the glue that sticks the health service and holds it in suspension in many cases because people are stuck in the acute system. But we've also got a massive workforce problem in social care, which is not about how you fund it. And the government are making that harder, Nick, by saying that if you want to come here on a health and care visa to work in the care homes, you can't bring your relatives with you. That is madness. These are internationally mobile people who prove they are that, and then we're saying to them, yeah, if you do want to come here, you can't bring your family, you can't bring your kids.
Well, you are short by 150,000 people in the social care network. Look, time reasons only, I've got so much to cover with you. We've looked back, and thank you for your candid answers. Let's look forward for a moment. So let me ask you, first of all, briefly, what are you most proudest of during your 14 years in Parliament?
So representing the constituents and doing the casework, which is just so boring, but it's the bread and butter.
Lots of MPs say that. Do you really mean that?
I really, really mean it. Because as you remember from being an MP, people come to the MP when they're at the end of their tether and they've run out of options. And sometimes you can help really desperate situations and turn them around. I loved being a health minister. I think back to the decision that I took, and it was hard. I had to get it funded. I had to get it through Number 10 and Number 11 to extend what's called the HPV vaccine, which is what prevents cervical cancer, to extend that to boys. Previously, it was only done to for teenage girls. I've done that. My teenage son doesn't thank me too much for it, but I did that when I was in office, and I know that will save millions of lives. And we can eradicate cervical cancer, which Jay Goody died of, if you remember. We can eradicate that. That's an example of a decision that I took as a minister, which I'm incredibly proud of, and I think will change and save lives.
So I have to ask you, what's your biggest regret of your time in Parliament?
I would have loved to serve in the cabinet. I really would. I would have loved to have done that. Things were going well. You know, I was a minister. I think I was quite a well thought of minister. I think I did okay at the dispatch box, and I was probably climbing the ladder quite well. But Brexit intervened, and things were going great for 6 years. But as soon as Brexit happened, I knew that things were going to get very, very difficult for me because my seat hated it. And that made it impossible for me to stay in the government. And I would have loved to have gone up and had a chance to be health secretary and do more of those cancer decisions that I care so much about. I've lost both my parents to cancer relatively young in life. It's the thing that I care about. It's the thing that I'd like to do something about more when I leave Parliament. But yeah, I do regret that I didn't get a chance to do that.
I've got one really important question for you, but so I know you'll hold close to the heart. Would you, given all the toxicity around politicians at the moment, about the threats, the life, and looking back over your 14 years, in a word, would you still recommend to people that they should try and become an MP?
Yes.
Despite the intimidation, the exposure, the unjustness sometimes that they face, you still think it's the right thing to do?
Yes, because it's a way to change the world and a way to change your local community. But what I always say to young people who say, I'd like to be an MP, I say, okay, put it out of your mind, go and get a career, go make some money, go and get a hinterland, get a profession. Because this job, as you know, when you lost in 2015 and you then had to find a new life, I'm choosing to go and find a new life. This job doesn't last forever, either at your choice or at the electorate's choice. So I always say to young people, yeah, do it, but make sure you've got something else in reserve.
Steve Brine, currently MP for Winchester, former Minister and Chair of the Select Committee on Health. Thank you very much for joining us here today on Westminster Watch. Well, don't forget to check out the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.